and we are very pleased to have with us today Karen O'Brien, who teaches at the University of Oslo, and she was sharing with me just a little bit earlier that she's been living in Norway since 1997. I think many of you are familiar with her work around the transformation spheres. She's been an author on 4 IPCC reports. She's very involved with the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystems. She's on the Science Committee of Future Earth. She has, as I mentioned, sort of pioneered the thinking around transformation spheres, which would be the personal, political, and practical. She has a number of books out there, including one that's coming out on June 4th called You Matter. And maybe she can tell us a little bit more about that in her presentation. And one of the papers that I was really struck by that I just only recently discovered was called Climate Change and Social Transformation. Is it time for a quantum leap? And that appeared in a journal back in 2016. But when Karen talks about quantum leap, she is literally talking about the notion of quantum social theory and how that relates to all of our efforts to help engage people and help amplify our efforts around climate action. So I think with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Karen. And thanks for being with us today.
And thanks so much for inviting me here to talk to you. I'm going to just share my screen, and then I'll start. And and it's really great to be here to talk to you today about education for transformation, which I distinguish from education for sustainable development or climate change education, because I think it really is about how do we actually teach people or approach the issue of climate change and other global crises from a very from the perspective of transformative change. And let me just get my PowerPoint in the right place. And a lot of this is based on my research on climate change. I've mostly been looking at climate change impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation over the last years. And the question of adaptation and the limits to adaptation has been really of interest to me. So over the last few years, I've been working on a project called, at the University of Oslo, called Adaptation Connects. And we're really looking at not just how do you adapt to climate change, but how do you adapt to the very idea that we are transforming the climate and creating these risks. So the CONNECT stands for Combining Old and New Knowledge to Enable Conscious Transformations to Sustainability. And what we're really trying to get at is what are the conditions that can actually promote transformative change. So we're looking at creativity, collaboration, empowerment, and also flexibility, for example, of narratives or thought patterns. And the different work packages or sub-projects are related to Art Connects, Coffee Connects, Travel Connects, and of interest here is Education Connects. And here we're looking at how do we empower people not just to limit their carbon footprints or to, to take these individual changes, but to actually have, collective agency, political agency, and shift systems and structures and things. So it's very, very much about how do we, exactly what ECOS is working on and how do we empower people. And the point of departure, again, comes from climate change and from the IPCC's conclusions that, the future is a choice and that with substantial mitigation, we still have a world that we're going to have difficult times adapting to of 1.5 to 2 degrees warmer world. But without this additional mitigation, we're living in a world, that is hard to imagine. And in the IPCC synthesis report in 2014, we concluded with high confidence that without additional mitigation efforts beyond those in place today, and even with adaptation, warming by the end of the 21st century will lead to very high risk of severe, widespread, and irreversible impacts globally. And I think that that's, it's really a powerful conclusion, and yet, what are we doing? We're trying, really hard to like change the world and try to find those leverage points that might make a difference. And it's not just climate change. It's, all of the so-called planetary boundaries that include biodiversity loss, land use change, freshwater use, nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, etc., but also the society that we live in. So we're interested in social equity, gender equity, health, food, water, income, education, everything. So how do we transform not just climate change, but maybe using that as an entry point for addressing the deeper and broader dimensions of the problem? And when we're looking for leverage points, we're always looking for small changes that can make a big difference. And I think that what we're seeing, the whole nature of climate change, but also the nature of the coronavirus, are showing us that small changes actually can make a very big difference. And just over the past month, it's been, remarkable to see how much, when we remove the stressors on the planet, grounding airplanes, reducing fossil fuel consumption, reducing a lot of the human impacts, that we actually can have an impact on the environment. And this article came out yesterday about the temporary reductions in daily CO2 emissions and being about 17%. But the authors also emphasize that these numbers put in perspective both the large growth in global emissions observed over the past 14 years and the size of the challenge we have to limit climate change in line with the Paris Agreement. And they emphasize that most changes observed in 2020 are likely to be temporary, as they do not reflect structural changes in the economic, transport, or energy systems. So that raises this question of transformations to sustainability and exactly what needs to transform, by whom, how, not just the means, but the manner. And so some of the questions that we're interested in looking at is, how do we transform at the scope, the scale, the speed, and the depth that is called for in response to climate change, biodiversity loss, and other global challenges? And again, the manner is important. So how do we transform in an equitable, ethical, and sustainable manner? And this brings us to this question of, what is the relationship between individual change, collective change, and systems change? How do we do that? What is the role of the individual in that change? And that brings us to the question of, do we individually matter or not? And that's where I think coming into education for transformation, it becomes really important to, what type of a narrative are we sharing with when we teach students about this, and what type of education are we prioritizing? When we think about education for transformation, my collaborator Robin Lyshenko and I have been trying to think about, what would transform like an integrative approach to climate change look like? How can we help students or anyone, students, teachers, faculty, everybody, see patterns, relationships, and systems, understand and activate individual and collective agency, and probably more important, view problems from multiple perspectives and to see different, see it from different dimensions, question some of our assumptions and paradigms, recognize universal values, and then finally engage with experiential and embodied learning. So it's not just what we teach, it's how we teach it, it's the way that we frame the problem, because that actually influences the way that we see the solutions. So trying to bring in this idea of transformation into education and to start to look at, what does that actually mean? And there's many different ways to define it, and people, we could talk a lot about what are the definitions, but I think very roughly and simply, it's physical and or qualitative changes in form, structure, and meaning making. And it's exemplified by the caterpillar's metamorphosis into a butterfly, where it changes its form, it changes its structure, and it also changes its meaning making, because the butterfly sees a very different world than the caterpillar. But transformation also goes a lot deeper than just the form, structure, meaning making. It is also what Monica Sharma refers to as the powerful unleashing of human potential to commit, care, and affect change for a better life. And I think that this is one of the, where a lot of the emphasis on transformative change comes from, is this idea that we can do better, that there's a huge difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees and 3 degrees and 4 degrees warming. So how do we actually activate those changes? individually and collectively, and to shift the systems. And that brings me then to work that I've been doing with Monica Sharma since about 2009, with what she calls the conscious full spectrum response. And we've translated into the language of climate change and sustainability as 3 spheres of transformation. And here we talk about the practical, the political, and the personal spheres of transformation, all of which are very interrelated and interacting and leads to outcomes for sustainability. And I'll just kind of walk you through the 3 spheres of transformation as we see them. And it's a very simple heuristic for kind of looking at how these changes take place. And the practical sphere is, in the center. It's what gets most focus in most policies and international initiatives, local initiatives. It's the behaviors and the technical responses, the things that we can measure and observe, and it's very much linked to the outcomes and targets. For example, the SDG targets or the 1.5 goal, etc. So it is the number of people on bicycles, the number of solar panels, the number of courses on sustainability or climate change. It's everything that, number of girls in school, etc. The things that we really want people to change or want or think is aligned with the change, with the outcomes for sustainability. And it's here where we tend to put most of our emphasis, but it's also where we tend to be very stuck because we're not making these changes at the pace, at the rate, and the scale that are necessary. And often that's because we're ignoring or not really looking at the political sphere. And the political sphere is the systems and the structures, the social and cultural norms, rules, regulations, and incentives that influence the way we collectively organize society. So it's very much about, it's not just political in the political system, but it really is about how do we collectively decide where to put our resources, how to use them. Should we have public-private relation partnerships, or should we be thinking about minimum viable living wages for everyone? And the political sphere is probably the most important because this is where we tend to get stuck. It's where you reach these polarized arguments or fights about what should happen in that practical sphere. And with climate change, we spent decades just to come to a voluntary agreement in Paris. And you can see the polarization in many of the countries and many of the efforts to go backwards rather than forwards in terms of environmental policies. But it's also the sphere where you get social movements and activities and people visioning different types of futures and different ways of organizing and being in the world. But again, often we're just stuck in this political polarization and not necessarily moving forward, and almost in this like the politics of just not getting there where we need to go. And that's because we're often ignoring the personal sphere. And when I say personal sphere, I'm referring to both the individual and collective or shared beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms through which we actually see the system and how we see ourselves in relation to others and in relation to these systems and structures, and what we prioritize as the goals in the practical sphere. So the beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms are always there. They're influencing how we relate to the world. What is our idea of causality? Do we think we actually matter? Who leads, etc. And often when we start talking about beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms within climate change, there's a general agreement that yes, we need to change people's beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms, as if we're putting it right into the practical sphere to turn it into kind of behavioral and technical responses, how to change people. And that really is limiting because you're actually making people into objects to be changed rather than the subjects of change in their own lives. So the nuance is how do we work in that political sphere collaboratively, collectively with people who have very different worldviews and values and beliefs. So it's not about changing others, but it's about how do we work together to come out with these outcomes. And again, all of these three spheres are, this is just a heuristic, but they're always, we're engaging with them all of the time. And Zanella Meadows, in her paper in 1999 on leverage points, places to intervene in a system, she talked about 12 leverage points for systems change, and they kind of roughly map onto these three spheres where the constants, parameters, and numbers have a very low leverage, the taxes and all the parameters and numbers that we are trying to shift. And what has much higher leverage are the systems changes, the reinforcing feedback loops, structure of information flows, the rules of the system, and the power to influence the system. And the highest leverage points I relate to the personal sphere, the goals of the system, the mindset or paradigm from which the system arises, and the highest leverage point being the power to transcend paradigms. And this is where then I get, as Mark was talking about earlier, very interested in, if we want to be changing, if we're in the decade that matters and we need to be changing rapidly, maybe we should be actually looking at paradigms and how they relate to the practices. So that's why I think that when you shift the paradigm, you actually change politics and practices at the same time. So much of the way we've been looking at the world is still a remnant of the Enlightenment worldview, Newtonian physics, and the mechanistic, atomistic, deterministic, reductionist, materialist world where matter is dead and where it's kind of that we're on a trajectory and this is the way it's going to be, and it doesn't acknowledge free will, it doesn't recognize consciousness, etc. And when I started and talked about the future as a choice, if we actually don't have free will, then what kind of choices do we have and who's making them and how do we actually get there? So there's a lot of problems when you start to think about, how do we change society? Are we just a machine, or is there other alternative paradigms? And this brings us to that there are many alternative paradigms from indigenous cultures, from wisdom traditions, from all over the world. And Andreas Weber talks about going from the Enlightenment to the Enlivenment worldview that is based on lived experience, embodied meaning and experience, meaning, subjectivity, consciousness, interbeing, spirituality, and the idea that matter is alive, that it's vibrant, that it's more than just, we're more than just things in space. And I think that this is probably the way many people in the world experience life, and yet the science itself is telling us that we're pretty much doomed because of climate change, and it doesn't actually activate that sense of individual and collective agency to engage directly with change. And not to say that like the Enlightenment paradigm is so dumb. I know that in the social sciences and the humanities, it's been challenged for years. And even within the, in physics, it's been challenged for 120 years now. In just reviewing this history, some scientists have said that quantum mechanics forced physicists to reshape their ideas of reality, to rethink the nature of things at the deepest level, and to revise their concepts of position and speed, as well as the notions of cause and effect. So at the atomic and subatomic level or molecular level, reality is not what it seems, as physicist Carlo Rovelli writes. And I think that that's something that there's so many different interpretations of quantum physics, we don't actually understand that, but yet we keep moving at the social level as if we are just kind of programmed marbles, heading for extinction, etc. And it is that idea that we are, and I think I was provoked in Carlo Rovelli's 7 Brief Lessons on Physics, on his 7th lesson on humanity, where he concludes that we are just, like other animals, we're headed for extinction because of climate change, because we're not responding to this. And so this has led to an inquiry by many people on alternative paradigms for, underlying the social sciences. And international relations theorist Alexander Wendt has been challenging his own constructivism in international relations theory and looking at, what if we were to reinvent the social sciences today? And he concludes that the conceptual, logical, and methodological tools of quantum theory offer the potential for revealing new social phenomena. And his idea is that if human beings really are quantum, then classical social science is essentially founded on a mistake, and social life will therefore require a quantum framework for its proper understanding. And so he promotes or develops a quantum social theory that that really challenges the way that we think about social life and the social world. And it doesn't necessarily it basically supports the constructivism and interpretism in social sciences, but it does this from a very materialist physical perspective. And so it's raising a lot of interesting debates and discussions within especially international relations, but also the wider social sciences. And this is because it actually has methodological implications. And there's been a number of researchers in all different fields looking at what would happen if you used the algorithms and the models of quantum physics in the social sciences. So in this review book, Haven and Krennikov talk about quantum social science having the goal to investigate problems within the wide remit of the social sciences, whether economics, finance, psychology, sociology, or other domains of inquiry, with the help of the formal models and concepts used in quantum physics. So you have quantum decision-making that allows for preference reversals. You have quantum game theory. You have quantum economics. You have all different ways that are not necessarily saying that reality is this or that, but they're just saying that this allows for context, that allows for us to be more human, and it actually provides better predictions and projections. There are many other different interpretations of quantum physics. Karen Barad, a feminist theorist and physicist, talks about agential realism, where matter is not a thing but a doing, a congealing of agency through which phenomena come to matter. And I think that's where I find a lot of resonance in terms of education for transformation, that role of mattering, and do we matter, what matters, and how does our whole idea of mattering influence the way that we engage with nature and each other. And I could go on and on with different interpretations, including quantum Bayesianism, which is based on this idea of participatory realism, where our beliefs influence where the wave function collapses, and so and so. But I think what is really important here is not whether, what you think about quantum physics and social science, but it really is about the language you use about change. And especially the metaphors that we're using. We're talking about hothouse Earth, the 4-degree world, even the greenhouse effect is a metaphor. And George Lakoff and Mark Johnson wrote decades ago that about the power of metaphors, especially, including in science, but new metaphors, they argue, have the power to create a new reality. And this can begin to happen when we start to comprehend our experience in terms of a metaphor, and it becomes a deeper reality when we begin to act in terms of it. And they argue that much of cultural change arises from the introduction of new metaphorical concepts and the loss of old ones. In other words, they argue that we actually have some choice about the words we use and what metaphors we're prioritizing in our languages. And so from quantum physics, we've been given, or we see more and more use of the notion of entanglement, not just meaning like intertwined, but non-locally correlated. And Alexander Wendt would argue that this happens through language and through meaning and through consciousness. Other metaphors of complementarity, both and, can be very important to realize that we are individuals and we are collectives. We're both and it's not this either or. It's being able to hold this liminal space of the two being at one, not two but one. And finally, and really important, I think, for education, is the idea of potentiality, the idea that there are possibilities, and that that it's not a deterministic future, and it's about really then how do we bring the future we want right here and right now to collapse that wave of potential into what something that works for everybody, what Buckminster Fuller would call a world that works for everyone. And so, how can we use these languages? How can we use these ideas and actually start to teach a different way of framing problems and solutions around climate change? Physicist David Bohm has warned years ago about the dangers of continuing with a fragmented worldview. He says what is primarily needed is a growing realization of the extreme great danger of going on with a fragmentary process of thought. And he talks about like more of a generative order. And he gets into, moving beyond this idea of just fragments and silos and separation and individualism and atomism, and moving toward this idea more of fractals. And I'm very interested in, how do we approach change through a fractal perspective? Fractals are patterns that repeat themselves across different scales, self-similar patterns that repeat themselves. We see them in nature, in beehives and leaves and river basins, etc., but also in algebra and geometry. When we start to look at them in society as urban fractals or fractal politics, it's not just a self-replicating pattern, but it's based on certain values. As Monica Sharma writes, each idea, initiative, or endeavor has the same characteristics of the whole, but those characteristics really are tied to what we value. And so her argument is that the space of the most potential for a paradigm shift occurs when systems and cultures are transformed based on the root of our being, on our oneness. And I think that's the appeal to me of quantum social change, is that it really is based on this idea that a fractal approach, where when you stand in values such as dignity, fairness, and compassion, it applies to the whole as well. So, and she argues that these are inherent in us and stifled through socialization, rigid systems, and cultural norms. So when I work with the three spheres to understand transformation, it's very much in a research-based focus in understanding it, social change. And Monica very much uses it as, how do we activate social change? And her background is as head of leadership and capacity development at the United Nations. And as a medical doctor, she had to scale out HIV/AIDS treatments and treatment for women's health initiatives. And she's distinguished then, how ineffective these partial responses are. If you're only working in the practical sphere, only in the political and practical, or only in the personal sphere. And her point is that the starting point is standing in universal values and actually working from those to shift systems and cultures to create measurable outcomes. And so her approach really is to recognize that we are always we're always working with these three spheres in the moment. It's not about prioritizing on timescales or anything like that. And she's tested this in 60 countries with many different themes and issues. And I think that idea that we are these fractals of change and that we actually are influencing society at all scales, it resonates with Alexander Wendt's kind of flat ontology, that the structures are just popping in and out of our heads all the time, and they have real manifestations, but these are all ideas. And this figure, Mark actually helped me, or he came up with this figure for this book that I'm finishing on, applying his powers of 10 framework to a fractal framework to really recognize that, the individual level influences the family level. If you're grounded in universal values that apply to the whole, it applies to all scales, including above and beyond the global scale. And I think that that's a really important message to get across to people, that it's not, that we tend to feel that we are just so small and insignificant that we can't make any difference. And when you see the Greta Thunbergs, and you see that, often we can make much more of a difference because we're social, because we're wired for connection, and because of language and meeting. And so when I in teaching this and trying to get this across to students, I often have them do, have them do something called a C challenge, which is making one small change for 30 days and then looking at it from the practical dimensions and the political dimensions and the personal dimensions, and starting to really see change differently, and to see how, we actually give reflection questions and help people to really start to interrogate and start an inquiry into what's involved in change. And often they see, right away that it's not just what they do, but it's how they're influenced by social norms and how they can influence social norms. And change is about the conversations that they make with other people and how those conversations spread and influence things. And so really being able to see the systemic factors and the structural issues and their own assumptions about change becomes really important. So this idea that a small change can make a difference becomes really important, and not just trivial changes, to reduce your carbon footprint, but really like how we are part of the very systems that we're trying to change. And this brings us to, I think one of the conclusions that in this education for transformation is to focus not on people as the problems, but people as the most powerful solution to climate change that really exists. And starting to recognize that, if we can actually activate that collective sense of agency based on values that apply to the whole, across all fractals, etc., then we probably can respond like that. That is, I think, the basis for that quantum leap, or a real shift in the way that we see and be in the world. So with that, thank you very much, and I'm happy to have a discussion or take questions. And I'll stop the sharing.
Thank you so much, Karen. Could you say just a little bit about the book, which is coming out soon? And I understand you're going to have a webinar to help sort of unpack it for people.
Yeah, the book was a response kind of to Carlo Rovelli's 7 Brief Lessons on Physics, where he concludes that we're going extinct because of climate change. And he doesn't actually take into account all the, what we know about social change and the social sciences and the humanities. And I think, so I got very provoked by that, because it sold millions, and it sends a very powerful message. So You Matter More Than You Think is really about quantum social change in response to a world in crisis. And I've been writing it over the past 2 years, and we'll make a PDF available in June, and then have a webinar to start discussing it and everything, and also revising it, because it has a lot of interpretations of quantum Bayesianism and different ways of thinking about what matters, and including how time matters, and metaphors matter, and getting to this idea that we matter, and that the I and the we is a collective space, and that non-dual space is very much tied to the dual space that we experience in our regular classical world. So I'm very interested in just seeing how whether a perspective, whether we can actually start using a different language to talk about change in relation to climate change.
Well, I know that having had a preview of the book, I know that a lot of people on this call will be really interested in that. And once it's available in PDF, we'll make sure people who are signed up for the ECOS mailing list can have easy access to it. Let us know also when the webinar is scheduled, and we can help to get the word out.
Yeah, we're planning for the book to come out on June 4th and the webinar on June 18th. So that's the plan right now. I'm working with an artist to illustrate it, so she's drawing and painting madly.
Great.